Hi, my name is Ann Helmreich. I'm the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, and I want to welcome you to our last event of the fall semester. And today's event, I'm thinking of it as a double billing in that it is both part of our faculty work in progress series, but it also fits our theme of globalism that we're exploring this academic year. I also think it's appropriate that a talk given by John Grabowski is a double billing because John wears more hats in university circle than anyone I know. John is the Krieger-Mueller Associate Professor of Applied History here at Case Western Reserve University, and at the Western Reserve Historical Society, he is Vice President of Collections and the Krieger-Mueller Historian. As a scholar, his interests range widely. He's a specialist in immigration histories and co-authored Polish Americans and Their Communities in Cleveland. He and his wife, along with David Hammack, edited Identity, Conflict, and Cooperation, Central Europeans in Cleveland from 1850 to 1930. He's also an expert, as you can tell, on Cleveland's history and authored Sports in Cleveland and Illustrated History, and co-edited and contributed to the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, the Dictionary of Cleveland Biography, and Cleveland, A Tradition of Reform. And this does not even include all of your publications. One of his emerging research projects is on Turkish immigration to the United States, and he also has developed several innovative courses that engage with Turkish universities. Today, he'll be speaking to us about 20th century Tazimat, privatizing higher education and museums in Turkey. Please join me in welcoming John Grabowski.
Thanks so much, Ann. I believe I'll be projecting well enough here. Several things happened that I'll use as sort of a light preface to this. Ken Grundy had asked me where my slide projector was. He accused me of selling out to PowerPoint. And he was right because my memory stick would not work in this computer, so there had been a little bit of haste in getting the PowerPoint up and running. So kudos to Ken. And I've had at least one person indicate this talk is in direct juxtaposition, it's an approximation to Thanksgiving, so we got into this issue of turkey. I'm not going to go there. That is usually what I get. To sort of start on the back end of this is that I think the growth rate in the Republic of Turkey right now is about 4 to 6%. They seem to be doing very well. And as I talk about the evolution of higher education in Turkey, we'll find out that is a growth industry there as well. But I need to explain two things. Why I, as an immigration historian, I'm standing before you and talking about educational and institutional history. And also what this title means. And I think the latter question, when I answered, is more pertinent to what my research is doing, but the former deserves some explanation. I was lucky enough to spend 2 Fulbright semesters teaching in Turkey, and I taught at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey. It was 1996, 1997, 2004, and 2005. And I became fascinated with Bilkent because it was a relatively new creation. It was founded in 1984 and it admitted its first class in 1986. And it now occupies a substantial piece of real estate. And I was fascinated how something that could grow that rapidly and have a student body exceeding 10,000 students. So the growth of the institution became of, I think, special interest to me. And also the nature of the institution, because it is Turkey's first private foundation-supported institution of higher education, and I was curious as to how that came about, and that led me into very many stories that you'll hear today. And of course, I'm also an applied historian, and I looked at Bilkent and I saw that they had anniversaries coming up. We do it every 5 years, you know, and I advocate to my students that we should change and have anniversaries on prime numbers. I think that'd be more effective. That aside, I talked to the rector of the university, Ali Doramaja, when I was there in 2004, and suggested that I would like to work on a good history, but a pictorial coffee table book that would celebrate the university's 25th anniversary, either of its founding or of the admission of the first class. That proposal was in stasis for a while, and I suddenly got a call from the rector's office in March of 2005 asking me to come in, and I ended up, try to make a long story short, I have ended up working with people at Bilkent making films promoting the institution and talking about its history and the biography of its founder. So I've become sort of the Bill Kent talking head from Cleveland. Those films over, 2 years ago, I approached the rector again and said, what about the book? And he sat down, he said, well, I have a better idea for you, John. He said, what we need is a scholarly history of higher education in Turkey, which folds in the Bill Kent experience, and would you do that? I am currently in negotiation with the rector right now to indicate that my preference would be to contribute some chapters which lie within my expertise to the book and to engage other scholars who know some of the territory far better than I can. Obviously, any of my research on this topic, as well as my research on Turkish immigration, is compounded by the language difference. And so on this project, I've had the assistance of a man named David Barchart, who is a Brit, who has long experience in Turkey, is extremely fluent. He's written for the Financial Times and the Guardian. He knows Turkish politics inside and out. And we've also had the assistance of various Turkish graduate students who have looked at documents and have begun doing translations for us. Nevertheless, it is a difficult process of moving forward. So what I want to do is talk about the book, but I want to tell you what the title is, because living in Turkey has forced me to deal with the various histories of Turkey, the Republic of Turkey and the Ottoman history of Turkey, which in the popular mind are strictly bifurcated. One ends and the other begins. I don't want to get into contemporary Turkish politics at this point, but I tend to see cultural continuities. They're continuities that could not be obliterated by the Republican Revolution, as strong as it was, and I would argue as magnificent in its own way as it was. So the Tanzimat was a period roughly from 1830 to 1876 when the Ottoman Turks saw the need to reform their society, because they were falling far behind the West in terms of military prowess, in terms of communication, in terms of industry. The Tanzimat was not effected easily. It was started by Sultan Abdülmecid I, and it effectively ended under Abdülhamid II, who had begun as reformer and then became some, I think, wrongly stereotyped as the antithesis of reform. But that's another story. So this was an attempt to move Ottoman Turkey into the mode of the Western way. I hate to use that word, but I can't think of a better way of doing things. And so what I see in terms of the privatization of higher education and museums in Turkey in the 20th century is really a continuation or a new Tanzimat. Now, I use the word carefully. I can use it here because I don't have a division of Turks in the audience, and to use the word Tanzimat with some secular Turks is problematic because it resurrects the Ottoman past. Nevertheless, I think it's appropriate. Let me get into the research and tell you about it. This is a funeral in Turkey. It is late February of this year, 2010. We'll tell you who is being buried, but this is the current president of Bilkent University. The son of the man who's being buried is Ali Doramaja, educated at Cornell and Stanford, long on the faculty at Rutgers University. As we go down here, we are looking at respectively the prime minister and the president of the Turkish Republic, Erdogan and Abdullah Gül. I believe this is the head of the military, the armed forces. I'm not sure exactly what his identity is. This is the now discredited opposition leader, Deniz Baykal, of the Republican People's Party. And standing here is former president, the man I think politically in Turkey is made out of rubber, Süleyman Demirel, who has been in and out of power for years. Obviously, this is an important occasion with all this power standing there. The man who's being buried is known as Hoca Bey. Essentially translates to Mr. Teacher or the Teacher. And it's Ihsan Doramaja, the founder of Bilkent University. Much of what I intend to do, and what I want to accomplish in the history, is to link Ihsan Doramaja to the evolution, to see how well he links to the evolution of higher education in Turkey. This is a picture of Ihsan Doramaja slightly 2 years before his death, and I'm going to go through some points on. I am fairly convinced, given what I know, and it is difficult. We'll talk about research. We have some questions about where do you do your research, where do you get the facts and the details. A lot of it is published, and a lot of it is word of mouth. I have yet to get deeply into the archives, and my students and colleagues have yet to find and get deeply into the archives. Nevertheless, I will argue, because so what I know, that he is pivotal in creating a sea change in Turkish education and also in Turkish medicine. We can touch on that. I could give you his whole CV here, but I don't want to do that. I want to pick out certain things in his life that I know about that I think indicate why he was the right man, to use the cliche, at the right place at the right time. He was born in Erbil. When he was born in Erbil, it was still part of the Ottoman Empire. As he reached early age, the Ottoman Empire fell in 1918, so he was 3 years old when the Ottomans lost control of what is now Iraq. So he grew up in a nation that was under a foreign mandate. He was not born poor. His family, his father was the mayor of Erbil. He would go on eventually to be a member of the Iraqi parliament, had long roots, and they were major landowners in the region. Their land happened to occupy areas full of oil. And so that oil fortune is part of the story that would be carried along with his son, Doramaja. When he undertook his studies, he became more cosmopolitan. He went to a preparatory school at the American College in Beirut. And he decided that rather than inherit the land and become an or a boss or a landowner, that he wanted to become a physician. His initial intent was he applied to the University of Edinburgh, was not admitted there, but he was put into a program at a medical school in Baghdad that had people from Edinburgh teaching. So he did his initial studies in Baghdad, and then he received his medical degree as a pediatrician in Istanbul in 1938. Now this is critical because he's in and out of Istanbul during the early years of the Republic. He knows where the power centers are. He's watching the change from the old to the new. He's extraordinarily astute. When he begins then to work out in the field, and there's a long story here, but he works under the tutelage of and in the field with Dr. Albert Eckstein. Eckstein is one of a number of European, mostly German refugees who were welcomed into the circle of Turkish medicine and higher education with the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. And so he's studying with a European who has deep traditions in medicine, and he's also aware of what is happening in Europe. So he's very close to Eckstein. These connections are incredible. He is, and I may be a bit biased personally here because I've met with him, I've talked with him, I've lunched with him, I've dined with him during his life. And obviously he had a particular story that he wanted to tell me. Much of that story I will accept, but most of what I found in the telling was the nature of the man. Not so much the story, but the nature of the man. He wanted to further his education. He practiced in Baghdad during World War II, which has been one heck of an interesting place. And then in 1945, before the end of the war, he and his wife, their daughter and their in vitro, their son to be, Ali Doramaja, went to the United States. They managed to fly out via Africa and come to the United States. And so he studied at Harvard and Washington University, and especially was in pediatrics. And this is the period that I want to find out more about. I want to know exactly who he met and what he did at these universities. He was present at the signing of the World Health Organization Treaty in 1946. He was the last living signature of that treaty. He met a variety of people, and I believe this is the point where he saw American methods of education, American methods of medical education, and also encountered concepts of foundations and philanthropy as practiced in the United States. As I'll show later, philanthropy and foundations are not alien to the history of either the Ottoman Empire or the Turkish Republic. He came back to Ankara in 1947, again, another significant time. He arrives in Ankara. His English is perfect. He speaks Arabic, he speaks Farsi, he speaks Turkish. And he comes into Ankara, and he's a pediatrician trained in the United States just when the United States has come close to Turkey through the Marshall Plan and subsequently in 1952 to NATO. He is highly in demand as young military families and officers move into the capital of Ankara. He makes all the right connections. His reputation rises. He becomes the pediatrician to some of the most important people in Ankara, including politicians, businessmen, and some people I'll mention later. Those connections are very important, but his dream is to do something, I would argue, in the American model. He wants a foundation-supported center for child health. The conditions in childhood health in Turkey at that time are not the best. Out in the countryside, they're abysmal. And as Turks come into the cities, a migration into the cities that actually begins partially because of American aid, Marshall Plan provides Turkish farmers with tractors, and it also builds roads. That there are critical situations in the Gecekunde, if you would call them the slums in Ankara. So he starts a Child Health Institute in 1955. Eventually that will morph into one of the largest hospitals in Ankara called Hacettepe Hospital, and that will morph into a teaching university, Hacettepe University. And the question is, how does he create that? Well, the Rockefeller Foundation is also interested in Turkey at this time. And Dora Maja makes connections with the Rockefeller Foundation, and I think the total sum of funds he receives in the 1950s and 60s from Rockefeller is over $700,000. And the funds are used to buy equipment for the hospital, but more importantly, to send young Turkish physicians to the United States for study. They study in the United States, he brings them back and integrates them in the hospital. Eventually, when he starts his new medical school, his curriculum, and this is why he has an honorary degree from CWRU, his curriculum is based on the new medical curriculum that T. Hale Ham developed here, partially based on that. So he looked at T. Hale Ham's. So what I'm arguing, he's an Americanized Turk, very much Americanized with very deep roots in the culture, very, very in. So he moves up to the rector of Ankara University, 60s, begins a higher education career here. He becomes a board member of Middle East Technical University, and we'll talk about that a bit later. From 1965 to 1967, and then he establishes a special law university. Again, I will talk about this, Hacettepe in 1967, on land about 10 miles outside of Ankara. He then leaves and becomes a visiting professor of pediatrics at the University of Paris. He is there, I believe, from 1975 on. In 1980, and this is where this gets controversial, he is called back to Turkey to assist in structuring the reform of higher education in Turkey. He is called back by the military government of Kenan Evren, the government that followed the coup of 1980. We'll get to that later. He becomes the head of an organization I'm going to detail later, the Council of Higher Education, which is the overarching entity created in 1980 to supervise all institutions of higher education in Turkey. Its Turkish acronym is YÖK. And let's leave that for later. So this is the setup, and where I come into this is this university, which is disappearing rapidly from the screen, Bilkent, which translates as Bilim Kenti, City of Learning. And some shots on the campus. Founded in 1984, grows rapidly. It has 9 faculties. It has a vocational school in tourism. It expands over 3 different campuses adjacent to, next to Middle East Technical University outside of Turkey, and also close to Hacettepe University. And it is a remarkable institution. I sometimes refer to it as the Emerald City. Because it's so outstanding. It's modeled on an American university campus format. So if I talk to European exchange students who are at Bilkent, they feel like they're at an American university. So it is a first. And it stands straight right in the middle of some extraordinary changes. And I can only do some statistics here for you. In 1923, the year of the founding of the Turkish Republic, there's one, it's not even called a university at that time, it's called the Darülfünun, which is a remnant higher education from the Ottoman period. It will become Istanbul University. It is there, and I put down missionary because there is Robert College in Istanbul as well. Started in the 19th century by American missionaries, Cyrus Hamlin being the chief one. By 46, at the end of the war, there are only 3 universities plus Robert College. By 1970, it has grown to 8 and only 1. And most of these are in the major cities of Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir by this time. 1917, it grows to 17 universities. They're beginning to try to propagate universities in the hinterland. 1992, you begin to see 27, and there's Bilkent as the first private university, and you will notice that there is no longer missionary school. We'll talk about that. 2010, the most recent statistics, and we're looking at a growth industry. 94 state and 45 private foundation-supported universities in Turkey. That's an extraordinary, and arguably, the ability to create Bilkent set up the basis for creating other foundation universities. So I will be working more on Bilkent's history, but the charge to David Barchard and myself was, well, the entire history of universities in Turkey, and the question is, where do you start to fathom that? And we were told, look at the Turkish laws governing higher education. As a social historian, looking at laws to me is fairly boring, but it is very revealing because universities in Turkey evolved to meet the purposes of the state. And this begins even in the Ottoman period. Higher education, or education if you were, during the entire 500 years, the Ottoman period was focused largely on what we call madrasas. The Turkish word is medrese, which are the religious schools, which would train people for the ulema. And that was essentially what some Ottomans began to feel in the late 18th and early 19th century was weighing down progress in the Turkish state. There were no modern institutions of learning. And initially what they began to establish were military academies, which taught ballistics, shipbuilding, and other things. One of the oldest technical universities in Turkey, Istanbul Technical, is an outgrowth of one of these. The model for these, the people they brought in, were French. There's a great admiration among liberal Turks for the French Revolution, and there was quite an exchange in the middle 19th century between France and Turkey. And that then brings in lycées, which were initially started in the European parts of Istanbul, or I believe also in Izmir, to educate the children of the foreigners living within Turkey, but eventually they opened up. So if you're a Turkish football fan, this is a history of light. There's a team called Galatasaray, and it's named after the Galatasaray Lycée, which starts out as a lycée. Eventually, in the 19th century, and the history of this is very checkered, it is an institution of higher learning called the Darülfünun. It starts, it stops, it starts, it stops. It is buffeted by people who are pushing for progress and people who are pushing against progress. But in each of these instances, the need was, we need to provide education on a par with the West in order to compete with the West. That's very simplistic. 1932, Albert Malch, Swiss educator, is brought to Turkey by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, to investigate higher education in Turkey and to make recommendations for the modernization of higher education in Turkey. He follows, believe it or not, John Dewey. Dewey was brought in initially, much earlier, to look at primary and secondary education to modernize that. There was an agenda here that we needed to modernize education at the bottom before the top. And then the top became necessary because as education at the bottom grew, there was a greater need for trained teachers. So Malch comes in, and subsequent to his visit in 1932, there's the first major law that's promulgated, Law 2252, abolishes the Darülfünun, and it reestablishes it as Istanbul University. It's first use of the term university in Turkey. It's universités in Turkey. It sounds very French. When what you see here is, what you'll see in these following slides, is a strong, tight centralist control, an ebb of that control, a reestablishment of that control. It goes back and forth. This is the way I would interpret it. University autonomy is abolished. The Ministry of Education is in charge, and some people say they retained some of the staff and they got rid of others. Some of the literature says that 59 members of the staff were purged. Now, this is where the complexities of reading through opinion, whether this was a purge or whether these were people who were incompetent. So were these people who had ties to the religious background of Ottoman Turkey who wouldn't fit in a new secular state? I cannot prove that. So the emphasis is placed on research and training. The flow of authority is very interesting. The rector is appointed by the head of state, Ataturk. upon recommendation of the Minister of Education. The deans are appointed by the Minister of Education upon recommendation of the rector. So you see this very top down. It's not unlike some European systems. There are bits and pieces of European systems here. And there was oversight and control of lectures and research. And so this is the setup. And this is a very difficult time for Turkey in the 1930s. Its economy is being moved toward a strong statist economy. The state is trying to, the banks, the factories begin to fall under a very directed economy. The universities fit into that. In 1946, this is changed with Law 4936. What's interesting, I argue that this law, and David Barchard disagrees with me, but David and I have our opinions, that this is parallels, this comes because of the move toward multi-party politics, single-party state up until this time, and closer ties to the U.S., the Marshall Plan in 47 and NATO in 52. And my argument is that there is pressure being placed on the government to be more open and more democratic in the way it deals with things. Again, that there needs to be more research done on it, and I'm going to say there are better people than I who will be doing this. The universities become autonomous. They're recognized as separate legal entities. Minister of Education is just a supervisor. He presides over an inter-universities board. And the rectors, deans are internal matter. Their election is a matter within the university. At this time, you create Ankara University, their faculties there, and they create some additional universities. That knocks along until some special laws, and these are really important. Middle Eastern Technical University dates from an interest from the United Nations of providing higher education that relates to community planning, science, and technology. And METU, as it's known, or ODTÜ in Turkish, was created to provide the technocrats, not only for Turkey, but for the broader Middle East. And you see this fitting a little bit in the Cold War, don't you? The United States takes a strong interest in METU, and there's an up and down with the US. It's governed by a board of trustees. Very unusual. The board appoints the rector, extraordinarily unusual. And the staff is contractual. It's a contractual ladder. So this is a special law that was passed to allow this. More changes occur. In 1961, Turkey has a new constitution. The red lettering indicates that these changes occur after, yes?
How does the role of rector fit in with kind of roles that we recognize?
It's the president of the university. Yeah, it's the analog is the president here. All these red letters, this is 1 year after the 1960 coup, which took Menderes from power. This is the 1971 coup. So what you see are some changes here. This is fairly liberal. 65 legislation is quite interesting. It authorizes private for-profit institutions of higher learning. The reason behind this is to rapidly train people to fit into a changing, modernizing economy. Special law here. Hacettepe is Dr. Doramage's creation. So there's a special law. The rector has a longer term and it's renewable. The deans have they're looking for continuity. That's what Doramaje wanted in this, so he got it there. Amendment to the Constitution then in 71, this is quite interesting, allows the cabinet to take over any university at which academic freedom is threatened. Now, to drop back, I don't know how many of you realize that during the 60s and 70s, there was incredible conflict, particularly in the 70s in Turkey between right and left. There was a growth of the left in Turkey in the 60s, which was pushed upon. There's a growth of a very radical right in Turkey in the 70s. And the violence, a lot of the violence took place on university campuses. METU has the honor of being the place where the US ambassador's car was set fire to by the students at one point. So this essentially is trying to dampen that down from the 60s. And in 60, we're not certain of the date, these for-profits are outlawed because it turns out that they're more interested in making money than providing education. 73, a new university law. They try to pass what is the predecessor of what exists now, this Higher Education Council. You can see it's very, very strong. It's ruled unconstitutional in 1975, so it really doesn't last. But more centralized control. course lengths are normalized, tuition and fees, rectors are still be elected, and they try to grow, because what they're seeing in the 70s in Turkey is that this is still very much in Ankara and in the western part of the country. They need to create universities in the further parts of the east. And the problem there, though, is how do you get a faculty member to go to a brand new university without much infrastructure and support in a small town in eastern Turkey? And this is when Boğaziçi Robert College becomes a state institution. The preparatory school is still private. 1981, and this is basically where you get to where I am with Bilkent. The higher education law is passed. If you want to see all the articles, I will Xerox all the sheets and email them to you. I have them. They cover almost every aspect of academic life, including what you wear. It consists of 68. This is done under Hoca Bey's tutelage. And when this law is created, he brings in a group of academics, including some from Canada and the United States, to meet in Ankara and to discuss what should be done with Turkish higher education. And it is a grand centralization. So this, in its following manner, here we go. This is the composition of the Council of Higher Education. They're chosen by the head of state, the president of Turkey, first state. And then the other ones need the consent of the head of state. You can read this as well as I can. So it is a very self-contained, very powerful organization. And what it is confronting is a disjointed, I would agree with this, rather fractured system of higher education in Turkey, in which there has been chaos. Now, you lay over that the fact that you have a military coup, and this becomes a very touchy issue to argue about, to deal with. Nevertheless, I can give you some statistics as to what's happened after YÖK. One of the criticisms of YÖK, as it is known, the Council of Education, Higher Education, is it's fine unless the government changes, and some of the secularists would say, well, if the government changes and they have appointment control, then it upsets the secular nature of education. I've been working off a book, or actually a thesis by a woman named Nurgün Oktik, which was done at Durham University in 1995, and it's probably the best source I can find on this. So that's the setup, and this is what happens. So there is control all the way through. 1982 Turkish Constitution, there's a new constitution. Now that is the constitution that is, if I'm correct, I'm looking for a nod from knowing people here, is now the last, there was a referendum in Turkey recently that has said that we can go ahead and change the constitution. Not that it hasn't been modified, but this is it. It defines the purpose of institutions of higher education. Paragraph 2 provides for the establishment of institutions of higher education by foundations in accordance with the procedures and principles set forth in the law, provided that they do not pursue lucrative aims. Nonprofit foundation funded. That is the clause that Doramaja had been looking for his entire life. He wanted to be able to separate universities and run them not-for-profit in the same way he was able to do with some of his medical facilities. And Article 131 reifies, if you will, YÖK. So that's where Bilkent comes from. It is permitted. Doramaja uses his own family money and foundation money. The question is, where does the Bilkent money come from? It's quite an interesting story. Unlike many foundations that we know here, endowments, where somebody of wealth puts it in the bank and you live off the earnings, there was some suspicion of the solidity of the banking system. So what Ihsan Doramaja ended up doing was taking the family wealth and creating a series of companies. He actually created the first one to build Hacettepe University because the state-run company just wasn't doing the job fast enough. And that then ended up into a company that's called Bilkent Holdings right now. There are over 40 different companies. So if you fly into an airport in Cairo or in Istanbul or in Ankara, it has been built by the construction company, which is part of Bilkent Holdings. They run a furniture company, they do paper. The earnings from those companies, which are they're fully held by the university, those earnings roll over into the endowment, the foundation, to support it. So that's how this has been going on. I once talked to Ihsan Doramaja about endowment, and he said, well, not endowments. we need to earn money and use money from the earnings. That leads it into what the book's going to be. This is just briefly, this is what we're looking at now. And we have some possible authors. This may end up, I would hope, and I'm going to be going to Turkey in a few weeks and meeting with Ali Doramaja and seeing if we cannot construct this study of higher education in Turkey as a sort of festschrift to honor his father. But there are people. Barchard can probably do these 2 chapters. He really does know the political background. Felice Bickman is working for the Sabancı Foundation, and she's done some of the best work I've seen on third sector and foundation history in Turkey, and so she would do that. Ergun Özbudun is a lawyer who teaches at Bilkent and has done a lot of work with law relating to higher education. Even though the law was passed to allow Bilkent to be created in 1991, some opponents tried to strike it down, and it was Özbudun who testified that it was a valid law. And I will probably do this, and this will focus largely on Ihsan Doramaja. That's what we're looking at. But let me get to the other part of this talk, because this gets into museums. This is what I'd rather be doing, is museums than higher education, because it's my life. The word that translates to a foundation in Turkish is a vakıf. And so the vakıflar were basically were pious and social purposes. They would endow, support, they would build mosques. They would endow and support the soup kitchens or the hospitals at the mosque. They would support the medrese. It was basically, the Ottoman government did not do much until the 19th century other than, military actions and do an overall run of the state. Ottoman government did not put in water mains. They did not put in sewers. Those were done by the vakıflar, where the individuals would put up chesmes, they would put up fountains as for a water supply. So this was very much, if you're looking at a third sector that has a lot of power, and you can see it's a huge number. During the Tanzimat period, almost half the assets are centralized because what the Tanzimat does says the state should be doing these things. So the vakıflar begin to be pushed into the background. And then when Ataturk takes over, there are 2 issues. A lot of the vakıflar are religious, and he is creating a highly centralized state. And so they are even pushed further out. They still would support buildings and other things. I'm trying to sort this out. It's a very, very difficult thing, particularly because I can't read the Turkish documents as well as I should. They're regulated by the foundation's directorate. In the same way, there's a religious directorate that trains people for religious positions within Turkey. There are actually new foundations established. And this is quite an interesting group. Its Turkish acronym is TÜSEV, 1993. It's the third sector foundation of Turkey. It's formed by civil society organizations who will argue that a lot of even modern foundations in Turkey are focused on building buildings. They're on structures. They're on monuments, if you will. And that they're arguing that more foundations need to use their resources to assist directly in charity and civil society. And there have been some new enabling legislation for that. Just some foundations I'm going to go through. This is Doramaja. His first foundation is 51. And then he has other ones. He's doing a lot of work in Erbil now. The family's trying to build schools in Erbil in northern Iraq, the Turkmenistan area. But I'm going to give you 2 names here, Vebi Koç, and this is Ömer Sakip Sabancı Foundation. And there are now, if you're looking at other private schools, I'm going to segue to museums in a second. In Istanbul, there is Sabancı University and Koç University, both established by those foundations. There are other foundations established by, in one case, a man who runs the training schools for people who want to pass the examination to get into Turkish college. And they support, and this gets into a lot of, which university did you go to and who's running the university. This is a private foundation-funded university called Fatih University. Mehmet the Conqueror is known as Mehmet Fatih. And so my secular friends are a bit chary about that. Yet I've worked with students from there, and they're extraordinarily bright. So I love museums. And museums, there's a wonderful book by Wendy Shaw. It's called Possessors and Possessed. It's a history of the rise of museums in late Ottoman Turkey and it's a little bit on early Republican Turkey. And one of the things the Republic of Turkey tried to do was to create museums that would buttress its view of the deep history of Turkic people. And so one of the finest museums you'll find in Turkey is the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, which is in Ankara. And essentially that has an incredible Hittite collection, but that was kind of the Ankara, the line from Ataturk. And there are hundreds of state museums which are run by the ministry, but there are now these new private museums, and I'll go into. This is the Koç Museum at the Cengizhan in Ankara. You're looking out over Ankara. Now, where does the Koç family come? Ihsan Doramaja, I will argue, is different than some of the other wealthy Turks because he has a very distinguished Ottoman pedigree. I could go into his wife. His wife, Ayser Süleyman, who's still alive, and she's an extraordinary individual. Ayser Süleyman's father was Hikmat Süleyman. Hikmat Süleyman was, in 1936 and 37, the prime minister of Iraq. One of her uncles was a Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. Another relative was the Ottoman general who defeated the British at the Battle of Kut. So we're looking at this cultural continuity. I'm not disparaging here. Rami Koç, the Koç family, became wealthy when Vehbi Koç, who was a businessman and had a small store in Ankara, prospered during the 1920s and 30s when the government switched, when Ataturk said Ankara, not Istanbul, is our capital. And so Ankara, which was a sleepy, old, interesting town, just exploded. And so Vehbi Koç's business exploded. And he ended up buying, he was selling oil products. Eventually he was dealing with Ford Motors after World War II. The Koç family is probably one of the wealthiest families in Turkey now. And so Rami, his son, started this museum. This is the Sabancı Art Museum. I would argue the finest private art museum in Turkey. And this is an old Ottoman palace that Sakip Sabancı, the son of the founder of the dynasty, bought in 1950. Interesting family story here. Ömer Sabancı, the man who started this, came from Kayseri, very interesting town, central Turkey. And he went off to pick cotton as a young man. Eventually became a cotton broker. And the long story is that led into a bank and businesses, cotton factories. Sabancı Holding is a hugely important place. Sakip Sabancı just died. So that is, they bring in major European exhibits. And art history, and I'm looking at my colleagues here, modern art and the display of art in galleries are just, in Istanbul, they're just growing rapidly. So these are two private museums, and they're made available because of foundations. Now their competition is the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism. But the first private museum established in Turkey, arguably, is what is known as the Saadettin Museum, which is on the banks of the Bosporus in Istanbul. And this was the Koç family summer home, which they bought and then turned into a museum of period rooms and then an ancillary building that has collections of coins and antiquities. And then Rami Koç, the son, created arguably, I would say, probably the most modern interactive museum I've ever seen in Turkey, the Rami Koç Museum of Industry in Istanbul. It's kind of like the Crawford Museum on steroids. And Rami Koç was brought up well, and he was a collector, and so he started it to put his collection in, and now it has grown enormously. And then they created another museum in, actually it's very much akin to, there are no historical societies. There are no private historical societies in Turkey, at least there weren't until the Vehbi Koç, which Ankara Research Center. So what they do is they collect materials that relate to the history of Ankara, beyond the city. They're just fascinated by this. And then Koç did a branch, that's the picture that you saw here. And then Sabancı starts his museum in 2002. This is a museum to watch, the Istanbul Modern Museum. There seem to be no impediments to the growth of museums. There seem to be no impediments, so far as I can see, to the continued growth of private universities in Turkey. Let me, I think this may be my last slide. Let me close by saying that that's kind of research in progress, and my focus on this research will be on the story of Ihsan Doramaja and the manner in which he affected the establishment of foundations and and private universities in Turkey. But the whole book itself will be an overview of the rise of higher education in Turkey, and we'll go back to the Ottoman period. But what I really want to begin sinking my teeth into is more of this museum change that's going on, which is one of the reasons Anne mentioned that we have, I've taught joint courses with Turkey, and there's a real need for museum studies, cultural management programs in Turkey. The Koç family, of course, because they have so many museums, runs a cultural management certificate program at Koç University. There's also a museum training program at Istanbul Technical University. But given that so much of Turkey's foreign exchange is brought in by tourism, there is a need to provide tourists with the best museum experience possible. If we have time for questions, I can get into some of the arguments there. But I would say this: when I was last in Turkey last year, I was talking to one of my colleagues there, and one of the Bilkent companies is called Bilintur. It runs tourism sites and hotels. I guess they still have one hotel left. And they were one of the people bidding with the Ministry of Culture and Tourism was going to keep running the museums, but they wanted to privatize the gift shops. And so they were looking for bids on privatizing the gift shops. Privatization, though, is not limited to museums and universities. After the military government left, Prime Minister of Turkey was a man named Turgut Özal. In the 1980s, he became president of Turkey, and it was under Özal that a lot of privatization of state resources began. And that is going on, and it continues to go on, and it is creating some angst among people who've had secure jobs with the state over the years. I was rather amazed, and I'll close with this, that the Turkish company that did all alcoholic products, Tekel, has been bought out and privatized. And one of the old Tekel factories is now part of the Rami Koç Museum complex. So I think that's essentially what I'm trying to do. So if we have time for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I sort of lost track as you went through the progress of how the government was involved. Now, let's say the university right now, this private university, what say does the Ministry of Culture or the Ministry of Education have to say about what goes on there?
Considerable. I mean, there's certain laws, and I don't pretend to know them in terms of the internal appointments, but if you are a faculty member at Bilkent and you've gotten your publications in and you want to rise from docent, associate professor to professor, you can be approved there, but it has to go right up to YUK to be approved. So that's essentially, one thing that has changed, though, is that the appointment of rectors has been decentralized to a degree. It was decentralized in 1992. The appointment of foreign faculty, when I teach there, has to go through YUK. So there's still a lot. They don't determine the exact curriculum, exactly what's taught in the class, but there's certain cores that need to be followed through. I hope that answers a little bit.
Well, let's say some professor wrote a book or made a speech very critical of the government. Would he be heard from? Would the university be heard from? And if that kept on going, what would happen?
I don't see that as problematic now, and I'll say in a couple of instances, and it's not critical of the government, but several Turkish professors, getting into the Armenian issue now, have been writing about it, and essentially several of their names just appeared on an article in the American Historical Review dealing with the question whether it was a genocide or a massacre. They still have jobs as far as I know. But I've seen a couple of things happen. It varies. There was to be a joint conference on the Armenian issue in Istanbul, I believe in 2004, 2005, and the far right made a lot of noise about that. It was going to be held at a university and was canceled. Now that was, I don't know if that was the YUK, the Council of Higher Education canceling, or it was just a lot of pressure on the university to do it. I haven't, the usual statement is I can't answer that with any certainty, but I don't know of anybody in my faculty and my circle of friends who have written anything that has put them afoul. And they've been, some of them have been fairly forthright in what they've written. Yes?
Who are the students at the Are they international students?
There are international students. Well, at Bilkent, there are international students. There are international students at Koch. Bilkent, by the way, is an English language university. Koch is an English language university.
Meaning instruction?
Instruction is in English. Sorry, I didn't mention that. That's why I could function there. Okay, but there's a test given every year for university entrance, and depending on your score, it determines which university you get into and which faculty you get into. And Bilkent and Boyazici, which is former Robert College, they tend to get the cream of the crop in engineering. There's a lot of focus on engineering, and they're quite good. But some curricula, some faculties don't have terribly high score levels that you need. So students who get into that, they may not get a scholarship to go in, but if their family has enough money to buy them in. And Bilkent, I know what Bilkent is now, it's like 7,000 a year or 8,000 a year at one point. That's extremely expensive for Turkey. That was back in 2004. So you have that, but you have a lot of what they're called burslu students, students on scholarship. And when I was talking to the people at Bilkent, how do you start a university? This was one of the questions that intrigued me. Not only how do you build it, but how do you hang a shingle out and say, come in, we need students. Doramaja had enough money to offer very attractive scholarships. And so they've provided a number of full scholarships for students who come in there.
Are they mostly from the Middle East, the international students?
Yeah, a lot of international students. There are a lot from Arab countries. There are a lot from the Turkic countries, from Azerbaijan, from Kyrgyzstan. Ihsan Doramaja was very close to the Azeri family. Alevi, I can't remember his name. So yeah, there is that. His intention in establishing it is he didn't want it to be a Turkish university, he wanted it to be broadly. And Istanbul now, I know that Koç does get a lot. Yeditepe, I don't think has a lot of foreign students. Sabancı is really interesting in that they have basically almost done away with the concept of departments and work by faculties. They work within faculties. It's very experimental and it seems to be working out for them. Some universities I can't judge each on their merit. I can say this is one number I've remembered, that in 1980, 6.3% of the college students in Turkey went to college. And in 2006, the number had risen to 38%. It's a very young country. That in 1980, Turkey ranked 49th in the number of citation publications. It's up around 18 now. So that's what's happened. And the other thing that needs to be put in place is if you go to Istanbul, there's a huge growth in terms of what I call, not service sector, but banking and finance and advertising and so forth, and how many of the people have gone through Turkish universities. If I were asked to see a hole in this, is that I taught graduate students at Bilkent. I basically work on their masters in history. Almost every one of them wanted to go for a PhD in the United States. So for higher level education, they're still looking abroad. And a lot of them are now looking to Europe because the EU connection and the Erasmus program is active there. Yeah.
So I know your focus of the book is on higher education, but I can't help but ask a question relating to museums. So, but this goes back to something you mentioned when you were talking about the higher education, the law that said, and I'm looking at my notes, do not pursue lucrative aims, which I think is such an interesting way to put it, as opposed to saying nonprofit.
Yeah.
It's like it allows you to have some profit, but not lucrative profit.
That's a good question. I'm sorry, please.
Well, no, I was going to say, and then so I'm curious about that aspect of it, and then how that affects the museum as well, because you talked about them taking the gift shop, the state appropriating the gift shops, but then are there admission fees at museums? So like if you develop a lot of interactives and you get a lot of gate traffic and become lucrative, so
That's exactly what they're looking for, to generate income. And there were points when faculty, there were breaks for museum admission to state admissions to Turkish citizens, and those have been somewhat lessened. And there were points when foreign faculty at Turkish institutions got the same break, and that has been stopped. Now that's minor, but there are cash cows. Topkapi is one of the most popular museums in the world. It just brings in, you know, tens and tens of thousands of people. But it also extends to the private museums. And the man who ran Koch's Industrial Museum for many years was a British manager named Anthony Phillipson. And I got along fairly well with Anthony Phillipson. And I will say this for publication, you know, the Koch family can afford to run it out of their pocket. But Tony Phillipson was under the same pressure that many American museum people are to generate more earned income. So, you know, did you see the skylight in that one Koch museum? That's the old courtyard. That's one of the best restaurants in Ankara right now. Okay. So all the techniques that we know here in the US for generating earned income are being employed, you know, first in the private museums because they're businessmen and they see this, but now with, you know, I don't know what, you know, so let's say Bill and Tour gets the contract to operate all the gift shops in state museums. What does that mean? What's the give back to the state? What's the percentage on that? And I'm sure that's there.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, here, you get the magic wand.
Magical. Oh, because you have to be recorded, right? It's not that I can't hear you.
This is actually Ken's question. He worked we were in Southern California when they were just starting the state college system. And they were growing very, very fast. And part of the problem was people coming in on the ground floor may not have been as competent as some who came later, but they rose and controlled it. Mm-hmm. With this rapid growth in Turkey, how are they dealing with that?
That's part of what YUK does, is try to set standards for incoming faculty. And that sparks, I think, sideways, so forgive me. One of the reasons, and this was something that I kept hearing again and again, is that the politics within the university were, arguably by the people who favor YUK, were so bad that anybody could be elected dean or rector because the kickback from them would be positions and so forth. And so what happened is when YUK was created, and this is where it becomes a very complex issue, a number of faculty members were told, you're gone. Now the question is, were they gone because of their politics or were they gone because of their levels of competency? That's a tough one to figure out. So if you read Nurgun Aktik's thesis, she has statements on both sides of that. But I've heard this constantly, that the system was out of control, and exactly that people who got in there early were not the best teachers. And then they rose through inertia. And so I think that's part of the centralization. But the fact that this centralization is linked to an episode right now, there's a lot of looking back at 1980 and Ken and Evra in those years. And you know, I can't explain my own government. Okay, you can drop that from the tape. And so I can't really explain, you know, what's happening in Turkey at that point. The only thing I do know is that it initiated an incredible period of growth. It's not alone, because the population was rising rapidly, and there were outside pressures on Turkey to integrate itself into a globalized economic system, also to adopt more private, you know, enterprise. I mean, the 1980s are the Reagan years, aren't they? So you're looking at something else that is happening, that influences. But, you know, to go back to higher education is a tool to make the state survive. That's what Ataturk wanted Mulch to do. You know, what do we need in higher education to stabilize, to fortify the state? So that's a long answer to your question.
My question is there a rank ordering of universities in Turkey that is fairly reliable? Are the private universities displacing state universities?
I do not know. I will give you a personal observation on that the Boyazici, which started as a private institution, which is now a state-run institution, is an extraordinarily good school. And Bilkent is usually ranked the highest. But the bragging rights usually go to those universities who got the top test takers from the USSR. You know, we got 7, you got 6. I was looking at the rankings, international rankings of universities, and the only Turkish university that turned up on that, I forget which one it was Bilkent. Yeah. Down lower than I would have expected it, but it was there. So, I mean, this is like the college football rankings in some ways.
No, but if you're a rich family in Istanbul, where do you want to send your son?
Probably Bilkent.
Bilkent, not to Istanbul University.
Yeah, you might want to send him to Bilkent. It just has a lot of cachet. It has a lot of cachet. But it's like all the universities here. You know, I've had students who've been fairly wealthy and been excellent, and I've had students who are fairly wealthy and haven't been excellent. Yeah.
If you'd want to advance politically in Turkey, where would you go to?
I don't know the answer to that. And that's a very interesting question to be posed at this time.
Well, maybe we'll leave it at the interesting political question. And let's take this moment to thank John for a fascinating talk. Thank you.